Okay, well, later on the same day, 2nd of July, we're going to be going further into Dialectic into Dialogos and the Pragmatics of No-thingness in a time of crisis. And last time we were talking about the experience, the different valencies or aspects of the experience of um, no-thingness, or the Buddhist sort of emptiness, shunyata, that is disclosed within the practice of Dialectic into Dialogos. Um, we were distinguishing between them and then working out where to put them. There's different aspects of experience. In terms of the paper, we were exploring the first part of section 2, formulating the problem on page 59, and moved into the first two paragraphs on page 60. So I'm going to be going into the third paragraph on page 60. And again, like each part here is like the authors have been participating in the practice of dialectic into dialogos, and each part of the paper can sort of express that and unpack and reveal what it is about the practice that is relevant to the experience of nihilism, or on the other hand, theosis. And so these are different aspects of the no-thingness that is disclosed in Dialectic into Dialogos. What are its different aspects? And the key distinction is really between nihil, as in nihilism, nothingness, and theosis, as in becoming more like God. And so I'm going to name the key sets of opposites. So there are always a lot of polarities that we're going to be dealing with, and um, reviewing them is going to help us. So we were mainly dealing with, yeah, as I said, nihil and theosis, which are sort of different valencies of the experience of no-thingness as revealed in the practice. And they were connected with privative and superlative language, where the privative experience is more connected with nihil, as in nihilism, sense of something being taken away, and superlative is sort of like the best or most excellent within a category, and it's more connected with theosis, or the no-thingness uh, valence of no-thingness, rather than the nihilism or nothingness valence of no-thingness, if that makes sense. We'd say we were also dealing with the polarity of equivocation, meaning the idea that two things are completely unrelated. To see two things as unrelated, logical equivocation, and equivalence, meaning perfect identity with, to completely confuse two things which are actually distinct. Um, yeah, as I said, the idea is the distinction of nothingness and no-thingness. And these four sort of go together. So nihil, privative, equivocation, and nothingness as an expression of the meaning crisis, versus theosis, superlative, equivalence, and no-thingness as an experience of what might ameliorate the meaning crisis. But we've then talked about steering between Scylla and Charybdis. So the idea is that moving too far to any extreme is going to be unhelpful. And so we then moved into further and, in a sense, more abstract sets of opposites that were relevant to the discussion. And those were the explicit and the implicit, where the explicit is connected with the propositional way of knowing, and the implicit is connected with non-propositional ways of knowing. So it's procedural, perspectival, and participatory uh, ways of knowing. We had differentiation and integration, where differentiation is splitting apart into many different things, and integration is reunifying into one. So again, many and one is connected with differentiation and integration. But we also had dynamic, as in moving, and static, as in still, and then unresolved, as in um, meaning two things. One is like not finished, and one is in not clear, and resolved, meaning finished, and clear, clarified. And to summarize what I was saying, I think the authors, again, I made this these two different we had nihil, privative, equivocation, and nothingness as an expression of nihilism, and so theosis, superlative, equivalence, and nothingness as an expression of a response to nihilism. I think the authors sort of kept going and made it seem as if the explicit propositional and the differentiation into many, and the state of dynamism and the state of lack of resolution um, can be connected with nihilism, whereas the implicit and sort of integration and toward one which is then static and resolved, sort of connected with theosis, connected with the response to nihilism. And I think we can see that it can also be the other way around, where, yeah, I'm saying that what is implicit, the tendency toward integration, toward reunification in one, toward being static and resolved, meaning clear, and resolved as in finished, these can all be connected as well with nihilism, actually. And what is explicit or propositional, as well as what is the tendency to differentiate into many parts, the tendency for there to be many, to be in a state of dynamic state, and to be unresolved as in unclear and unfinished. These can all be also connected with no-thingness, or shunyata, I should say. So that is the end of my little summary. And so now we're going to move into paragraph 3. See how much of this I can get through. So, paragraph 3 on page 60. I'm just going to read out paragraph 2 for flow. So, this paper will argue that the psychotechnology of dialectic is a practice of discernment. It discloses the affective difference between valencies of no-thingness while integrating their aspects. Dialectic cultivates perspectival stereoscopy, a form of contradictory self-identity that functions as an opponent process that resolves into an implicit singleness and depth of being that the Buddhists call shunyata, or no-thingness. Now, this dialectic resolution is a traditional feature of the Socratic elenchus, wherein a proposition may be confirmed for accuracy while marked for insufficiency, and in Christian characterology, where a soul can be fated for virtue while being implicated in the fall of man. What does this mean? Well, yeah, there are many different senses of the word resolved that are relevant. So as I said, we were talking about there's a sense of resolution that is apparent in the dialectic, both sort of in the dialectic that the authors have participated in the dialectic revealed by the paper, in the dialectic between reader and paper, between anyone watching and between me doing this. So all these forms of dialectic can yield a sense of resolution in all different meanings of the word resolved. And I'm actually going to go through those briefly. So you could fast forward a little bit if you're not interested in the way these different meanings of resolved show up here. So the first meaning of resolved is a firm decision to do or not do something, meaning I feel resolved. And so by making these claims in the paper, the authors have sort of settled on this meaning of the dialectic. And so they've come to that resolution. This is what dialectic is. Because they say this dialectic resolution this is sort of resolution of what it is, right? And so resolved can also mean the quality of being determined or resolute. And I would say this quality is shown by the authors in their resolution of what dialectic is. So there's a sort of heroism or determinism in saying this is what dialectic is. It's a resolute quality being shown. 3, and these that you can find these in the definition of resolved or resolve in Google. So 3 is the 6, and this is 3 of 6. And the action of solving a problem or contentious matter is what resolved means. And so the idea being that this version of dialectic disclosed here is itself the act of solving the problem identified. So it's a sense of resolution, dialectic resolution to a problem, right? The fourth meaning from chemistry is the process of reducing or separating into constituent parts or problems. It's a resolution into different parts. And so it's where the problem is disclosed in the dialectic in the most granular way. So it's the idea of disclosing the problem by dividing it up into its different parts as well. The fifth meaning from physics of resolved is the smallest interval measurable by a telescope or other scientific instrument. So it's the resolving power of something. And so this is relevant where the problem or situation is clarified the most by and in the dialectic. So there's more clarity. We can you get more clear about what the problem or situation is within the dialectic. And the sixth meaning of resolved is the conversion of something abstract into another form. So the form of the dialectic here can bring the problem out of the abstract and into the existential. Certainly see that for me, for example. We're trying to bring it out of the abstract and into the real, the lived. by dialectic. Okay, so all those meanings of dialectic are contained, sorry, all those meanings of the word resolved, resolution, contained within the first part of that sentence. This dialectic resolution is a traditional feature of the Socratic Elenchus. And so the purpose of this paragraph is to give historical examples, essentially. It's just like, where is this coming from? Like, if dialectic is really doing this, do we have any history of this? And it's saying yes, both from the Socratic tradition and the Christian tradition. I'm not going to define Enlincus. It's a sort of, yeah, Socrates' practice of um, interrogating people. Yeah, I'm partly saying, I'm reading in here, and I'm going to say that the quote, the Socratic and Lencus wherein a proposition may be confirmed for accuracy while marked for insufficiency. I'm going to, like, all of that can be taken as John Vervaeke. Following on from that, quote, in Christian characterology, where a soul can be fated for virtue while being implicated in the fall of man, all of that can be taken as Christopher Pietro. I'm still going to state that and move on, and I'm not going to talk too much about that, but just sort of see what that reveals or brings out. I guess that's connected for me with a sense of um, wanting to connect more personally with the authors through their work and feeling that they are deeply personally present in their work, and that there are there is a relevant affective difference between them that I feel. Um, and yeah, that maybe like by talking about them and sort of drawing them into the talking about the paper a bit, it could disclose or reveal something that I consider interesting. And that is sort of this is sort of existential situation that is revealed through them and in them. And I think by showing that they're sort of implicitly present in the paper, that can be drawn out. So I won't talk too much more about that here. Yeah, so on a soul can be fated for virtue while being implicated in the fall of man. This is sort of the fallible, limited quality of people where we're in our fallen state in the Christian scheme, right? So it's like where what this brings up is a sense of role modeling for me, where like every person is kind of like an image of the divine, an imago Dei, where it's kind of like by everyone existing, um, the divine or transcendent or ultimate is kind of saying, yeah, it's kind of like that person, but kind of not like them. So like here's an approach to the divine. Here's a example of what the divine like. It's kind of like that, kind of like that, kind of like that, kind of like that, and that's what all people are. It's kind of like the divine. So this is um yeah, for me that came up this sense of yeah, the Imago Dei, like every individual modeling the divine. This comes up for me um yeah, in this section about the soul, where a soul can be fated for virtue while being implicated in the fall of man. It's a sort of, yeah, this sense of everyone being an imago Dei is this pointing to this betweenness category where people are at the same time an image of the divine and in our fallen condition at once. Anyway, it goes on. These two instances of dialectic combine. What I'm hearing there is these two people, namely John and Christopher, these two instances of dialectic combine to formulate an existential problem that in being and being ourselves, we essentially face non-being and being not ourselves. Okay, what does this mean? So as I said, these two instances can be taken as these two people, like John and Christopher. They combine to formulate um, the existential problem. And so I think the valence of that problem, so there's an existential problem which is being disclosed in the paper. And I think the valence of that problem is the main disclosure. So sort of revealing what is the feeling here? What's the valence of this? What does it feel like to be in this yeah, to unpack and uncover, to discover what is revealed in the dialectic into Dialogos, revealed, participated in by the authors. So the valence of that problem is the main disclosure of the paper. Yeah, and so these historical examples, they reveal this existential problem. Um, yeah, and so I really see the sentence as a major confession. So that in being and being ourselves, meaning being them, like in their being, right? And we could say in our being as well, to the degree that we're in the same trap. Hopefully not, though, if we can understand it better and work our way out of it. And so by being ourselves, so there's a quality of just existing, but also existing as persons and as selves. It's not clear which of those, persons or selves. It says ourselves, so I don't know if that refers to personhood or selfhood. I'm going to say probably both at this point. So it's not just that the existential problem is not just that we participate in being, but that we participate in being as ourselves, as the people that we are. And in that condition, there's the claim that we essentially face non-being. We're coming up against non-being, non-existence, um, and being not ourselves. And so it's like we not only are we coming up against non-being, non-existence, but we're coming up against the quality of not being a person, not being a self. This is an existential problem. Media vita in morte Kumus, I think it says. I can't, it's obscured by my comment. So it's as a Gregorian chant states, in the midst of life, we are in death. So I really see this as a similar confession as was found in Zombies in Western Culture, which I have published on. The equivalent there in that book would have been them saying on page 15, we are the walking dead. We are the walking dead. Um, so like hear that as a disclosure, hear that as a confession. Like we, the authors, are the walking dead. And again, like not just the authors, I'm not singling them out, although I just did. Um, but yeah, we as well, to the degree that we're participating. So in a similar way, in the midst of life, we are in death, as in we are in death. In the midst of life, we're in death. Um, and so yes, this existential problem that is revealed in nihilism by facing non-being and being not a self, being not a person. It has the quality of, yeah, we're living, but we're not really alive. You know what I mean? Where we don't have this, it sort of compromises vitality in some way. It can also be read, we are in the middle of life in death. We are in the middle of life in death. In the midst of life, we are in death. Anyway, it goes on. The aspect of non-being. So this is again, the sentence is sort of trying to get at what is this existential problem? And it's sort of this quality of being face to face with nihilism in the sense of face to face with non-being and non-selfhood, non-personhood, the absence of personhood and selfhood. This is the existential problem that we're attempting to talk about. The aspect of non-being brings us face to face with nihilism, a perennial crisis of meaning that dissolves personhood by ungluing the affective, aspectual, and agent arena relations we maintain as the context of livable reality. Yeah, so there's a bit there. So the aspect of non-being, and by aspect there, we sort of mean the visage. So like the way that non-being appears, the way that non-being looks to us. And so again, it's kind of assumed that we're sort of confronting it. We're sort of face to face with non-being. And I sort of, again, argue that there can be unintegrated masculine shadow that is sort of seemingly inherent within the Western psyche at this point, and that we project this masculine shadow of otherness, the otherness of the other, into nihilism, and therefore see it as a sort of enemy, something to avoid or get away from or confront. And I think that sort of prevents us from relating with nothingness or the problem of non-being more in a more, I would say, in a more feminine way, in a more empathic way, in a way which is more open and relational. And which is why when we're not doing that, when we're doing the, again, unintegrated masculine shadow thing of confronting the issue, then this aspect or this way of seeing non-being brings us face to face with nihilism. So there's a kind of when there's a confrontation. I'm just thinking of a little example here, like one of the ways to get men are much worse at talking about their emotions with each other than they are with women. So women are good at communicating with women about themselves, like in a deep and personal way, and men are okay at talking with women about it. But men are not so good at talking with men about that sort of thing. And because there's always a sort of implied threat of confrontation or violence, and that should be obvious with anyone that has any vague training in biology whatsoever, in primates particularly. But it's sort of like, for example, one of the ways to talk to men more easily is to be doing something with them. So, for example, be sitting in a car, sitting next to someone facing the same direction. This is a way there's less confrontation, if you see what I mean. It's less directly against. It's more like going with towards something in common, more teamwork. So this can be a way to yeah, sort of get men pointed in the same direction. And so there's this quality of like yeah, when we see non-being, um, when we see non-being in the way that we see a stranger and the otherness of the other. When we see it in that way, then there's a quality of being face to face with it. Whereas, yeah, I think I guess what I'm saying there is that the position of being face to face with the problem is actually something that could evoke this quality of masculine relating. Um, and so, by implication, that would imply that if there really is an other that we're facing, could we face the same direction with it? Is there a third direction? Like, how can we, um, let's say we don't fully trust the non-being. How can we orient toward, like, what is it that being and non-being have in common as a common enemy, let's say, or a common direction? What can they both point to? This could be, and I don't know. I think we can see the one as in God, as in there's a being which is beyond being and non-being. There's a God is beyond being and non-being. And yeah, that would do it, right? So like I think if we can have, yeah, this shared orientation, again, this relates to the alignment problem in AI sort of thing. Like if we can share our orientation toward reality, toward what is beyond. Um, again, these are just words that I'm throwing out here because we can't really talk about this thing. It's the one which is beyond all the categories. But having an orientation rather than just being face to face with nihilism, orienting toward what do we have in common, what can we look at together, can get us sort of working in a better direction. Whereas when we only see non-being as a threat, then we're sort of stuck in this face-to-face confrontation with it. Yeah, as I said, it goes on this perennial crisis of meaning. As I said already, I don't think it can be considered perennial because I don't think the indigenous traditions are suffering the meaning crisis. And so I think if we were to exact their cultural forms in terms of civilizational design, like as per Jordan Hall's Civium project, for example, I think we also may not suffer the meaning crisis. It may not be dependent, like solving the meaning crisis, solving nihilism, may not be dependent on dialectic onto dialogos, or indeed upon the psychotechnologies. It may instead be dependent on a specific way of living that can be inclusive of the psychotechnological practice, but does not require it. Um, so I'm pushing back on the term perennial there. I don't think we're in a position to know. In any case, there's a lot of evidence being presented that, um, yeah, practices. I guess what I'm kind of arguing there is that like all of these practices, you know, even since the axial revolution, that all happened after the invention of cities, right? After the agrarian revolution, after we started getting civilizations, and so all of those cultural developments are built within a yeah, sociological and civilizational architecture, which we can understand now to be inherently unstable and obsolete. And so it is certainly possible that within that inherently unstable and obsolete civilizational architecture, extremely powerful and useful psychotechnological practice could be developed. However, they're built on the wrong foundation. And so there's a way that I think it's quite risky to say, oh, we just need to use these psychotechnologies that have all been developed since the axial age, since the axial revolution, and that will solve the problem. When it's like, Yeah, there are deeper civilizational restructuring that need to occur, as per Civium, let's say, and within that context, it may be less clear what cultural artifacts, including psychotechnologies from our cultural period, namely from the Axial Revolution, may actually be a help or a hindrance. And I want to keep that in mind because the deeper civilizational architecture restructuring is going to end up being prerequisite to anything being sustainable, um, which has to do with how well these practices can last. That aside, we're in the situation that we're in now, and at the very least, we can reduce our frame, reduce our horizon to say, how can we continue to survive now that we're in this, you know, corrupt bureaucracy and all the rest of it? How do we continue things as they are? That was all about the term perennial. So we were saying the aspect of non-being brings us face to face with nihilism, a perennial crisis of meaning that dissolves personhood. Okay, let's talk about dissolves personhood. Yeah, I think so there's this risk that I've been trying to point to that I think nihilism could still be disclosed um, within the dialectic and at the sub-propositional levels. So this integration into one, which is static and resolved. I think this can still be a symptom of nihilism, and therefore, um, and vice versa, like the condition which is like more again more explicit, differentiated, many, dynamic, and unresolved can be more connected with shunyata as well. But I'm saying, so if the crisis of meaning sort of can dissolve personhood, um, I think I want to say about that that personhood is if what am I saying about that? Um, I'm wanting to say that personhood firstly is dissolved in any direction. So what do I mean by that? So personhood ends up being unglued by nihilism or deepened and resolved in the collective no-thingness, in the sense of collective no-thingness. So there's a way that I think our sense of personhood is going to be sort of inevitably radically updated one way or another, whether it's dissolved into nothing, subject to nihilism, or whether we're able to transform it by deeper connection with the ultimate transcendent, the real. Um, it seems that personhood is going to be transformed one way or another in any direction that we go. I also think that this is one of the claims that I want to put at issue. Like, I'm wondering whether personhood is itself vulnerable to nihilism or is part of the response to nihilism. So the claim here is that personhood is deeply vulnerable. Um, and so I guess I'm saying here that like, okay, I might agree that um, I guess I'm saying that it's the sociological factors, again, the way that we're living that constructs the agent arena relations um, that we maintain as the context of a livable reality. And if that were the case, then um, those might give rise to personhood, which could then be used to combat nihilism. I'm trying to get clear about what I'm saying here. And so, yeah, again, the claim is that personhood is vulnerable to nihilism, but I'm saying it might be part of the response. It might not be as vulnerable as we think. Yeah, so I might suggest that the causation might be backwards. So I think the authors think that nihilism leads to the ungluing of um yeah, the sentence implies that nihilism leads to the ungluing of active, affective, aspectual, and agent arena relations, which leads to the dissolution of personhood. But I'm sort of saying that this a sociological shift, namely the invention of game A, like the sociological shift to cities and so on, to civilization, that is what led to the ungluing. And that ungluing of agent arena relations, and so on, that itself led to, in history, the invention of personhood and also to nihilism. And so there's a way that I think personhood is a combination of being and not being, being what one is and being who one is and being who one is not. So I think there's a way that I see personhood and lack thereof, who one is and who one is not, let's say, um, as mutually arising mutually. And this may be an example of one of the developments of sort of Western civilization writ large that we want to preserve. I think where so the idea is, can we avoid the pre-trans fallacy? Can we avoid making a regression? Because if we accept the civilization architectural design that Jordan Hall is suggesting, sort of like from the indigenous traditions and do the civium thing, do we necessarily lose personhood? And I'm wanting to say, I don't think we want to lose personhood. I think we want to retain personhood. But it was a bit of a mix. I think we can just sort of say, I'm wondering how vulnerable personhood is or how robust it may be. And I'm wondering whether one's personhood could be broadened or made more, again, yeah, more porous, more fluid and flexible so as to accommodate its aspect of non-being. So to include non-being within personhood to a degree. And this would be a sort of way of working with non-being, working with, uh, non-being, rather than setting personhood against nihilism. In any case, I think we can see that there are going to be sociological changes. There are going to be practices which are available, and there are going to be shifts to our sense of personhood and to the sense of non-being that we experience, and all that is going to occur together. Yeah, I guess part of that as well is claiming that if we do move to different civilizational architecture, different sociology, let's say depth sociology, that maintains the context of livable reality, I think this comes with the opportunity, the affordance of deepening our sense of personhood, because it may be by really knowing each other, by being knowable, by being able to be known, by being transparent to each other, that we deepen and preserve our sense of personhood, and also are able to become more intimate with non-being, with what we're not. Because it strikes me that as we get to know who we are, we're equally getting to know what we're not. And I don't see that that is dissolving personhood. It strikes me that that is just as deepening of our sense of personhood. But I think the way of framing that would be to make one's personhood more porous, more open to include the qualities of what one is not for recognition. Yeah, and so nihilism is a perennial crisis, meaning that dissolves personhood by ungluing the affective, aspectual, and agent arena relations we maintain as the context of livable reality. So the implication of that is that, yeah, community can deeply integrate and embody the experience of no-thingness by committing to the practice of dialectic or by other alternative routes. Yeah, so there's a way that in order to yeah, I think there's a sense of non-being which has now been made available and clear, which is not going to go away just because we changed the sociology. So the sense of emptiness, the sense of shunyata, right, is sort of always with us in a certain way. And it's more about the valence, how it appears. And I think we're saying that specific forms of sociology, so specific forms of knowing each other, specific psychotechnologies for the sake of knowing each other and existing in the context of a livable reality, these can integrate and embody the experience of no-thingness with a certain valence thereof um, as the only viable way to live. And so the claim may be that yes, in order to live at all, in order to live sustainably, we may need to integrate and embody the experience of no-thingness, both individually and collectively, like intra and interpersonally, I think. Okay, so that might do for paragraph 3. Okay, I'm going to be continuing with the 4th paragraph on page 60, which starts with, she might reread the 3rd paragraph for flow. This dialectic resolution is a traditional feature of the Socratic Enlancus, wherein a proposition may be confirmed for accuracy while marked for insufficiency, and in Christian characterology, where a soul can be fated for virtue while being implicated in the fall of man. These two instances of dialectic combine to formulate an existential problem that in being and being ourselves, we essentially face non-being and being not ourselves. Media vita in morte cumus, as the Gregorian chant cries, in the midst of life we are in death. Tumus, I'm not sure it's good. The aspect of non-being brings us face to face with nihilism, a perennial crisis of meaning that dissolves personhood by ungluing the affective, aspectual, and agent arena relations we maintain as the context of livable reality. This paper will offer dialectic. This paper will offer dialectic as a philosophy whose form of life responds to nihilism by restoring the phenomenal functional telos of religious life, a metanoia, whereby turning to no-thingness is the realization of being in the non-being of oneself, and the realization of being in the non-being of reality. This function of dialectic does not simply apply to an intrapersonal resolution, but equally to interpersonal life, and develops a convergence between these two dimensions of reality. Between these two dimensions of relation. For Nishitani, confronting no-thingness is the only viable way to face the threat of nihilism. I have to tell the tale. My pen. And so this paper will offer dialectic. Immediately we can see that it's the dialectic within the paper that is offered, but it's also the practice of dialectic which the paper talks about, which is offered. So in this paper, the form of dialectic, in this paper, the form of the dialectic which is offered is philosophy. But we can imagine forms of dialectic where the form is not as philosophical. We can also say that within the paper, the form of dialectic which is offered is not only philosophical. I'm connecting philosophy here with the propositional level of knowing. And as discussed, the paper is disclosing levels of knowing. It's disclosing itself beneath the level of proposition and therefore beneath the level of philosophy. But it's presented at dialectic as a philosophy, is the claim. I'm saying it's more than a philosophy. But anyway, whose form of life responds to nihilism. Just on form of life, we can see that the form of life by which we mean sort of life as in the life force, as in libido. There's something there like the sort of the wellspring, the fountain of life, the source of creative energy within us. And it's sort of like the forms within which that arises, the forms through which that life energy flows. And the claim is that the dialectic is one such form that can properly form the flow of life energy. This paper will offer dialectic as a philosophy whose form of life responds to nihilism by restoring the phenomenal functional telos of religious life. So, importantly, as I've discussed, nihilism is co-emergent with, co-arising with the whole existential situation in which we're embedded, which can't be reduced to nihilism. So nihilism, again, the aim of this paper is to respond to the nihilistic dimension of something. And sorry, I'm saying that within the four-person dialectics between John and Chris and Jordan Hall and Guy Sangstock, something emerged that people have since then attuned to and found very interesting and meaningful. And that which emerged there emerged within the context of the whole existential situation in which we're embedded in the world. Part of which can be conceptualized as nihilism, and part of which can be conceptualized as the meaning crisis, but importantly, which cannot be reduced to those. And this is important because where that which is disclosed in such dialectic is prescribed as a response to nihilism, it is therefore, it runs the risk of being misrecognized, misdiagnosed. Where what I'm saying is, if we bring a problem framing to bear on dialectic, which is that, hey, we have the problem of the meaning crisis, we have the problem of nihilism, then the solution which is found from that point of view, from that perspective, the solution which is found, that which is disclosed, reveals itself as a response to nihilism and a response to the meaning crisis, which it is. However, it is also emerging within and co-arising with, as I said, the entirety of the existential situation in which we're embedded, which cannot be reduced to the meaning crisis or to nihilism. And so by this, I'm saying that it's fine for the paper to have the aim of addressing nihilism, and it's fine for the paper to present what is disclosed within dialectic as a response to nihilism, but we should not make the mistake of thinking that nihilism is only contingent upon the meaning crisis, that the meta crisis is not relevant, that what is disclosed within dialectic is not does not have a direct bearing on the meta crisis and the whole world situation in which we're embedded, which it does. So we might present it as a response to nihilism. We might present it as a response to the meaning crisis, but it is more than those things. Also, to the degree that we know what it is, that might be a risk. Like, I wouldn't want to present myself as knowing what has been revealed or what is emerging through such dialectic. As in, maybe it's a response to nihilism. Let's wait and see. I would hate to jump to conclusions there, which would involve, yeah, that could involve a problem misconstrual. Yeah, construing the situation in the wrong way. Which, I mean, we have to do that because we're coming from a perspective always. You know what I mean? So like perspectives go along with biases and limitations and realizing what's relevant to me, to my perspective. And it's, yeah, there's a way that whatever is being disclosed is always frame breaking, frame transcending. And it's like, maybe it's not fair to call that problem misconstrual when we look at it by bounding it in a certain way, because we have to do that. But I think it's important to be aware of as aware as we can of our biases. Yeah, and there's a sense of sort of yeah, we run the risk of jumping to conclusions, and taking from, I think that's 40, 41, and 42 about jumping to conclusions. This is about system 1 and 2 processing. And I think jumping to conclusions is sort of, maybe fallacious reasoning in some way. Like, if we get really excited about dialectic into Dialogos and we think that it's the kind of everything's coming down to that and it's the solution to everything, then we actually misconstrue what it is and the context into which it fits. Which is not to say that there isn't validity in conceiving of it as a response to nihilism and presenting it as such, but it's important to be mindful of what we're doing. And again, the context, the framing that I've broadened it out to refer to is my own, which is just sort of my piece to offer. Anyway, moving on. This paper will offer dialectic as a philosophy whose form of life responds to nihilism by restoring the phenomenal functional telos of religious life and metanoia. So phenomenal functional. So this is in the context of philosophy of mind. Phenomenal functional refers to a view that attempts to bridge the gap between phenomenal consciousness, what it feels like to have an experience, and functional consciousness, meaning the role of mental states in information processing and guiding behavior. So there's a connection between what it is like and what it does. So phenomenal functional suggests that our subjective experiences, or qualia, are intrinsically linked to the functional roles they play in our cognitive architecture. Thank you, Wikipedia. Yeah, so this is sort of John sort of talking about consciousness as you can't separate the what it is from what it does question. Those questions go together. And so um, so so there's an idea that there's a dimension of life which is called religious life. So the religious aspect of our life, and that it has a telos. It has a goal. It's working towards something. It's going forwards. I could actually maybe define telos properly. Yeah, it just means ultimate aim or object that will do for now for telos. So this is something that religious life orients us towards. And so if it's a phenomenal functional telos, the idea would be that the experience, like what it is like to have a religious life and the function of that religious life. Um, I'm trying to understand what is the meaning of this phrase. So dialectic is offered as a form of life which responds to nihilism. How does it respond to nihilism? By it restores something. What does it restore? It restores the phenomenal functional telos of religious life. So what I'm picking up here is that it restores what religious life should be oriented towards. So there's a telos in religious life. There's a toward which the religious life goes, and this dialectic restores the sense of that. And the further idea is that what's the point of having a telos to religious life? Well, it's a phenomenal functional telos, means that it has a deep connection between what it is like to have an experience and what is the function of that experience. So it kind of gets towards what is it like to have a religious life and what is the functional role of that religious life? And moreover, what is it like to have a telos within religious life? And what is it like what is the function of that telos within religious life? The dialectic is suggested as something that offers all of that or restores it. And one term that can kind of summarize all that, or say it in a different way, is a metanoia, which is a change in one's way of life resulting from penitence or spiritual conversion. So it's a response to nihilism that can result in a conversion or a spiritual shift in some kind, change in our orientation toward the telos of religious life. And like, of what kind or of what nature? So whereby turning to no-thingness is the realization of being in the non-being of oneself. There's a little ambiguity in this. It's a difficult sentence, and so I might not spend time unpacking it, but just to say it's sort of there's a way that if one feels oneself to be in non-being, then one can realize oneself as such. So there's a way that by moving into non-being, by moving into non-being, there's an opportunity for self-realization. And it's by moving into the non-being of oneself and by moving into the non-being of reality. So there's a sense that so there's a sense of emptiness, there's a sense of nothingness. And I just have to sort of state that that sense exists and people can be attuned to that or not. Because someone that's not a philosopher might say, what do you mean by nothingness? I don't know, it's a sense of there being nothing there. And so there's a sense of sort of emptiness within oneself and an emptiness within reality. that all of it is sort of hollow in some way or empty in some way. And so it's sort of equally within oneself and equally within reality, which is within the world, let's say. Um, and so the sense of hollowness, absence, lack, and meaninglessness, these sort of go together this is what we mean by nihilism. Um, but this dialectic is restoring as I said, a kind of spiritual conversion. It makes available a kind of spiritual turn, is the claim, where when we recognize the aspect of oneself, which is the non-being of oneself and the non-being of reality, when we realize this, that it's actually also self-realization. It's a realization of being. It's there is this. It's realizing the suchness. Realizing oneself as non-being and realizing oneself as the non-being of oneself and realizing oneself in the non-being of reality. Anyway, that sentence is complex and I'm not going to spend time unpacking it more. I'm going to continue. Yeah, I've written that I think the intention here is to make clear that self and world are very much tangled together at the level of participatory knowing, right? So it's this ongoing dynamic coupling between self and world, which can be co-realizing, co-shaping. And so by stepping into non-being or toward nothingness, there can be a self-realization of self and world. There can be a realization of the being of self and world within non-being, which is, to me, seems paradoxical. But anyway, it's to make clear, I think it's to make clear that self and world are very much tangled together, where the non-being of oneself is not limited to merely the subjective head-bound ego that we normally refer to. But this non-being of oneself also refers to this deep interconnection between the self and the world, and between self-world and reality itself. So I think the key idea again, there is that this quality of non-being, which can contribute to our self-realization rather than contribute to nihilism, that non-being is found within ourself, but also within the world, also within reality. This is the key point, I think. And the idea is that this realization, this is this kind of spiritual turning that restores a certain directionality to our religious life that is revealed through dialectic or in dialectic. And so this function of dialectic does not simply apply to an intrapersonal resolution, but equally to interpersonal life, and develops a convergence between these two dimensions of relation. So, yeah, so there's a practice of dialectic, and importantly, that dialectic can apply within oneself. So, like having a dialectic within one's head with, for example, different parts in the IFS sense. So different parts of oneself can be in dialectic, in dialogue. And this, like what dialectic does, can refer to this. But it can also apply in interpersonal life, where the dialectic can be between literally different people, obviously. And so the idea is that the functional role of dialectic can apply in both cases, both intrapersonally and interpersonally, can sort of steer us between nihilism and theosis, towards this metanoia, the spiritual conversion, both intrapersonally and interpersonally. And the further claim is that it develops a convergence between these two dimensions of relation. And so I want to make a claim that it may be the case that both intrapersonal dialectic and interpersonal dialectic are required, maybe necessary, for us to steer adequately between nihilism and theosis. It may not be sufficient to emphasize one at the expense of the other. Yeah, and so I've also said, if this were the case, then the self-other multiplicity of interpersonal relations would be required for the energy of life, while the apar, singular aparatic, or having the quality of aporia, the singular aporia of the resolution into non-being, may be the inevitable concomitant of the intrapersonal. So all I'm getting at here, what I mean by that is, if we just talk about the virtue of dialectic, we may run the risk of simply applying the functionality of that dialectic within ourself, which they're going to talk about happens with Kierkegaard. And I'm saying that um, there may be um, there may be dimensions of relationality and dimensions of otherness that are only disclosed in the interpersonal realm. So I'm trying to preserve a sense for the importance of the interpersonal, um, or the between people, rather than just between parts within our head. Um, yeah, so I'm saying that this, and drawing from Jung a little, so like the transference between people, this may be sort of this interpersonal dimension to things, dimension to dialectic, that may be required to facilitate the movement of the energy of life, or of libido, or of creativity, of the logos. Whereas the risk would be that dialectic within oneself may run the risk of always resolving into non-being and resolving into aporia in a kind of solipsistic way. Where, like, what I'm sensitive to there is that if we restore the sense of the dialectic, but only internally, then we sort of end up like this whole tradition of philosophers, which is sort of like too much thinking with oneself in one's head on one's own, basically speaking, and not enough engagement with the world and with people. Um, so I'm just sensitive to clarifying what may be important, again, about both intrapersonal and interpersonal forms of dialectic. And again, the conversance between these two dimensions of relation. I want to make a slightly small complexifying point on that point, which is that this conversance, sorry, I want to say first that there's, like, I want to talk about two forms, like talking within one's head to oneself and between different people. I want to say that there's a way that within oneself, if you imagine that each of the parts that we talk to are real people, then this could be considered interpersonal within oneself, but still interpersonal, which we wouldn't think of it normally. Normally, we'd think of within oneself as only being intrapersonal, but I'm saying there's a interpersonal form of dialogue that could be available within oneself. And so there's a different form, which is like literally between the different people form of dialectic. And I'm saying that if we really get a sense for the unity of being with other people, that we can also consider this between people form of dialectic to be intrapersonal, which we normally wouldn't consider it to be. Normally, we would consider it only to be interpersonal. So the distinction that I'm making there is between the importance, like I'm saying that both intrapersonal and interpersonal forms of dialectic are important, but both of those forms may be important within the kind of dialectic where we're talking to oneself in one's head, and within the form where we're literally talking to other people. So I hope that's clear. And moving on, it develops a conversance between these two dimensions of relation. Mostly going to leave that. I've said that that conversance is the logos, the middle way, the symbolic path. Leaving that behind. So for Nishitani, confronting no-thingness is the only viable way to face the threat of nihilism. Yeah, so there's a connection with viability. There's a connection with vitality. There's a sense that, again, this is like taking from Jung and my discussions in about psychological types and all. There's a sort of there's a sense of reunifying previously differentiated or disintegrated fragmented parts, and the idea that this reunification, this synthesis in some way, can restore access to the foundations of life, can restore access to the source of life, to the wellspring, to the fountain, if you like, to the water of life, to the fire, to the dialogical fire. So there's a sense that this return to this reorientation to metanoia, to this religious life, is also a return to viability, is a return to the conditions necessary for sustainable life, viable life. So for Nishitani, confronting no-thingness is the only viable way to face the threat of nihilism and return to tell the tale. Yeah, and so on tale, I wanted to mention here that as per the table that I laid out at the beginning, John has previously connected um, narrative order with purpose, with power, with techne, and with knowing how to proceed. He's also connected this with telos. Um, I think that's mostly from episodes sort of 47 on Heidegger and 48 of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. Yeah, there's a sense of focusing at that point, sort of focusing too much on narrative, and if we focus too much on these grand meta narratives to give us a sense of purpose, then it's too much sort of horizontal going through history and not enough of a vertical connection to reality itself as it is here. But what we can see here is that this the role that dialectic is playing in this return to the telos of religious life is that it can, in fact, give us a new telos, give us a new direction, give us a new spiritual conversion, but then also return to tell the tale, give us a new story, give us a new purpose, give us a new direction to go in. It can, and in the sense that it's give us like update our narrative order, but then also give us, and the implication would be that in some way it would give us more power in the world, the power that we need in a sense, in the sense of it being a psychotechnology, it's a kind of like a form of techne, complex form of techne in a way. And that can very much connect with knowing how to proceed. Procedural knowing is connected, yes, with the story that we tell about who we are and what to do, the purpose that we have, which are explicitly connected. So there's a connection here between the practice of dialectic, the telos to religious life, which is restored, and the story that we can tell about that. Yep. So moving on to the next paragraph, which is the final paragraph on page 60. It goes, it's another historical example. So the source tradition of dialectic is not merely Socratic or Buddhist, but also proto-existential. By proto-existential, we mean just preceding the period of formal existentialism in philosophy, which Kierkegaard is a representative of proto-existentialism. For Kierkegaard, the question of selfhood was the cynosure of ontotheological orientation. Okay, what does this mean? Cynosure means a personal thing that's at the center of attention or admiration. So the question of selfhood for Kierkegaard is really central for Kierkegaard. And it's the center of what? Of ontotheological orientation. Ontotheological means the combination of the study of being and the study of God. It's a combination of ontology and theology. Yeah, it explores the relationship between the nature of being and the nature of God, sometimes viewing God as the ultimate ground or source of all being. And so for Kierkegaard, the study of being and of God, the study of ontology and theology, his orientation towards ontotheology, the center of that study for him was the question of selfhood, meaning what is the self? And existentialism, we are the beings whose being is in question, is the existential question. Who are we? Which is a kind of a variant of what is going on. What is? Who am I? Would be the koan. Here, Kierkegaard applied dialectical opponent processing to the self by reconceiving it as a synthesis of spirit. And he developed his exegesis of the sickness unto death, despair, under several aspects of dialectic, e.g., as lacking in finitude or finitude. What does this mean? So this is a question of like, okay, Kierkegaard was doing this sort of dialectic thing that they're talking about, or at least they're deriving not just from they're deriving their dialectical practice not just from the Socratic tradition and not just from the Buddhistic tradition, but also from Kierkegaard, the proto-existential condition. Uh, yep, tradition. And so Kierkegaard was doing this dialectical opponent process thing with the self, and so namely intrapersonally, as in within oneself. And that's why earlier I was kind of focusing on this. Yeah, but we know that the interpersonal is also important. So I'm going to say that we can draw from Kierkegaard, but Kierkegaard also made several mistakes that we may not necessarily want to emulate. Yeah, and I guess what I'm sensitive to there is like I don't know. I think that Kierkegaard's biography is not exactly exemplary of someone that we may wish to emulate, and that I think that's relevant. I think that shows up in his philosophy. I'm not going to go into that in great detail, but just to say that yeah, so someone who was engaged to someone and then broke off that engagement to lead you know a solitary life as a writer, like okay, that's a choice, but I mean I think I'm not alone in viewing that course of action and that lifestyle as slightly neurotic, which is kind of ironic thing for me to say, but yeah, I think we can't solve nihilism by spending more time in our rooms writing more books about existentialism or smoking too many cigarettes in French cafes. We kind of like the 20th century kind of tried that, and like Kierkegaard was even doing that in the 19th century, and like didn't really work out so well. And so I guess I'm sort of drawing from psychology, I guess, but also from sociology of like, well, depending how we choose to live, these problems, these questions may or may not come up for us. Um, and yeah, I wonder how much we actually want to emulate Kierkegaard. And the reason that that is directly relevant is because, yeah, okay, we can use dialectic intrapersonally, as in within ourselves, to dialogue different aspects of the self. And like Kierkegaard was doing, that's great, like awesome. But then we wouldn't want to neglect the importance of interpersonal dialogue, um, because it may lead us to places that Kierkegaard was not able to go in any case, but because of his choice to neglect the interpersonal dimensions of life. Um, I would say that the choice of that lifestyle is symptomatic of the nihilism that he was trying to escape. Um, maybe if he'd sort of, Jung was saying that he sort of allowed his anxiety and despair to consume him rather than using them as a source of psychological growth. And I think there's truth to that, but that doesn't mean it's not worthwhile to explore Kierkegaard, which is exactly what we're doing here. I'm just saying that we don't want to take it too far, as we don't want to take it too far with anyone. Like we could study Nietzsche and derive value from Nietzsche without copying him. Okay, so what was Kierkegaard up to? He was applying dialectic opponent processing to the self. I would need to read more Kierkegaard to talk about that more. So, but what did they say that he did? So he reconceived the self as a synthesis of spirit. So we can see how this is going to be relevant with John. But anyway, I'll keep going. He reconceived the self as a synthesis of spirit, and he developed his exegesis of the sickness unto death or despair under several aspects of dialectic. Okay, so let's talk about this here. So Jung sort of talks about dialogue with the anima as a way to access the depths of the unconscious and give birth to the emergent center of the self, which he thinks is sort of that's Jungian individuation in a nutshell, sort of like this dialogue with this internal dialectic with the anima, with the soul, allows uh, Jung to develop himself. In the same way, we can see um, Socrates' ongoing dialogue, internal dialogue with his daemon, allowed Socrates to decide what to do. So internal voice of conscience, and sort of allowed the progression of Socrates' character in his life. Um, we can see how John has been developing this internal dialogical relationship with Hermes, and using that as a source of uh, guidance. But also, I mean, these are all just examples of the same sort of process. And so it's clear here that Kierkegaard is doing something similar. So this idea is this self is reconceived, where we have this sort of small self here. So for me, this personal identity would be Sam. I'm Sam, and there's an idea that by going within oneself and engaging a dialectic with some kind of personified character, be it a sacred second self or a divine double, or the soul or Socratic daemon or whoever it might be, there's a reconceiving of oneself as a synthesis of these different characters. And so this internal dialectic or dialogue between these characters um, is a kind of opponent processing of the self. So there's this sort of, I'm going to make a distinction here between self and ego, where this, like I named this, we could say this persona or this ego that this personal identity that I have, which is like Sam, right? So this isn't myself. So the idea would be that this limited ego-bound Sam, this personal identity, enters into internal dialogue with a kind of higher form of self, if you like, a higher figure within, and that is also not the self, but that there is a sort of uh, witnessing of that dialectic where the whole internal dialogue and reconstruction internally is regarded as the self, but it's also regarded by the self. So the witnessing is also constitutive. Anyway, so that's how, and importantly, this other figure, this divine double or higher self, sacred second self, this facilitates access to the divine, access to the transcendent, access to ultimacy, access to awe, to numinosity. And so that's how it allows us to reconceive the self as a synthesis of spirit. Where And so what this allows here is this is an application of the dialectical practice internally, meaning within oneself, and to engage different characters to completely reconceive oneself in a way that could allow better access to what we could call spirit, going along the lines of a direction to our religious life. So this gives a direction to our religious life internally, where for Kierkegaard, the alternative condition. So importantly, like this sort of resynthesis of self, this is a sort of solution to nihilism in some way. It's towards theosis, towards spiritual conversion, towards metanoia, and away from nihilism. Whereas for Kierkegaard, nihilism or sort of despair, the sickness unto death, is a lacking of one quality or another. And so what do we mean by that? And so importantly, like for Kierkegaard, let's talk about it in terms of infinitude and finitude. And so what do we mean by that? Well, this is dialectic, internal dialectic between different aspects or parts of oneself, where let's use the soul, the Jungian anima, because that's one that I'm familiar with. So this figure may have qualities that are unlike our own qualities. So there's a way that associating the personal identity tends to get associated with qualities related to finitude, to limitation, to being bound in time and space, to being here in this small body, in this small identity with very limited skills, limited words, or not, as the case may be. And this other figure, this, let's say the animal or the soul, it has a direct access to infinity. It's not bound in time and space. It's not limited by this body. It's not limited by this identity. And so the idea is that there's an opponent processing, meaning a back and forth thing, a co-arising, co-developing, co-emerging between these two different characters and the qualities that they embody and represent. Where So the idea would be that despair, or indeed nihilism, obtains or comes up, applies when we lack one or other of those dimensions. So if we go too much towards infinitude, if we focus our identity too much towards transcendence, toward the soul, let's say, and we don't give enough space within ourself to our limitations, to our small self, to our persona, to our boundedness, our finite nature, our humility, then we fall into despair. And similarly, if we focus too much on our boundedness, our time and space bound, place bound, identity bound qualities, if we focus too much on our earthbound identities, then we also suffer from despair. This is a claim that was developed by Kierkegaard. So this opponent processing of these different qualities represented and embodied by different characters, figures within oneself, is designed to fix that by integrating all of these qualities within a higher order dialectical process. Yeah, so the idea here is that the sickness unto death, or the despair that would later be named nihilism, one of the qualities of that is that it is lacking in either finitude or infinitude. It's lacking in some of the sets of opposites, whatever those might be. So it's either too much infinitude and not enough finitude, or it's too much limitation and not enough transcendence, this sort of thing. So it goes on. Under this condition, i.e., nihilism, under this condition, the aspiring movement to be oneself, e.g., by infinitizing oneself, can invert into a movement away from oneself. Okay, what does this mean? So when we're in nihilism, nihilism as conceived by Kierkegaard, this despair in this context, was this sort of, again, going too much in one direction and not enough of an opponent processing balance between different qualities. And so one of the ways that that condition, this nihilism, can show up is in the aspirational process. So if we aspire too much to transcendence, then, for example, by infinitizing oneself, by connecting with one's internal qualities of infinity, by connecting too much with God within, this can actually be a way of kind of spiritual bypassing, kind of moving away from oneself. So what have I written here? Yeah, so I've said that the authors would be subject to this denial of oneself, and also subject to this running away from oneself, subject to this despair, if they fail to resolve into viable metanoia as a response to nihilism. So I guess what I'm saying is here, it's kind of like by their fruits ye shall know them kind of thing, where I think the claim here is that the dialectic restores the phenomenal functional telos of religious life by facilitating a metanoia. And there's an idea that like it will, unless it actually does facilitate that spiritual conversion, then the sort of Kierkegaardian sickness unto death is what's left by definition. But I guess for them, certainly it has been a viable metanoia. So I don't want to be too strong. And just to say that, like this, again, this aspiration to infinitizing oneself, which is sort of like to become more like the divine within. So to over-identify with the anima, with Hermes, with the Socratic daemon, is a sort of not giving any space to the finite qualities within oneself. So this is an example of this aspirational movement being co-opted and uh, turned into nihilism. And they've given the example of infinitizing oneself, but it implies that it could also work in the other direction, as in by by denying the transcendent within, or by failing to, so for example, if you fail to create a personal mythology, this is a kind of the folly of meekness, which I'm saying sort of, yeah, is this focus too much on the finite nature of oneself the bounded qualities, not enough of a recognition that there is a way of aspiring toward God, let's say, toward the divine, toward the sacred, toward the transcendent. Um, this folly of meekness would, in game theoretic terms, and apparently existentially as well, succumb. It would lose. So it's a bad strategy. This is a subject to nihilism and subject to losing the game. So cut off from one's inner vitality, which is also the inner source of life, the source of the divine as well. So again, what we're seeking here is this dialectical opponent processing between, this is again within oneself, intrapersonally, between these different aspects, so that they're all given adequate space, adequate room to develop, and that the aspirational movement isn't co-opted by being steered too strongly in one direction, and therefore can invert into a movement away from oneself. Yeah, and so the reason that it's a movement away from oneself is that if one focuses only on one's qualities of infinity, for example, well, one actually does have qualities which are finite, and one is therefore denying those qualities. And similarly, if one focuses too much on one's qualities of limited, bounded, finite nature, well, one actually does have qualities of infinity, qualities of transcendence, and one is denying those aspects or qualities about oneself. And so again, just to name the condition that would look like this co-opting of the aspirational process toward the infinitizing direction. This is a pretty commonly, I think that's spiritual bypassing or sort of ego inflation, or at least that those have they're very common space that they have. It's a sort of pathology of going up and out toward ascending toward transcendence, not coming back down and in. So it's transcendence away from the reality that we are. There's not enough focus on immanence, being here now in our limited time and space bodies. And again, that's one of two errors there that could be made, as articulated by Kierkegaard. So it continues. Yeah, this aversion away from oneself, is a forsaking denial, disillusion, or impotent self-consumption. If it lacks dialectic countervalence, the tension that resolves the self authentically and teleologically in its establishing power. Okay, what does this mean? Yeah, I guess it's a sort of what we're getting at here is that normally when we think of aspiration to be oneself, we think this is a positive thing, a developmental process that can yield to growth and insight and development, maturity in general. And the idea here is that this aspirational process can invert and actually be going away from oneself. And here, this description is a sort of elaboration of the consequences of that, where there's this movement actually away from oneself by going so too strongly in one direction toward the extreme. This ends up being a self-denial. It ends up being actually a dissolution of oneself and a kind of quote impotent self-consumption, quoted from Kierkegaard, where there's a sort of spiraling in and down into oneself, sort of very reminiscent of what happened with Kierkegaard, which is kind of why I was pointing out what I was pointing out earlier. But anyway, the point here is that like I'm getting this, the qualities I'm picking up have to do with the Ouroboros, this self-eating, snake eating its own tail quality, and with self-hatred, with lotus eating from I guess Buddhism is sort of spiritual narcissism, sort of like going into oneself and sort of consuming oneself in this spiral of aspirational development only in one direction, and therefore denying these other qualities, denying involvement in the world, denying immanence of who we are, meaning denying our time and space bound, limited, mortal, fragile selves, or indeed the other way around, denying our transcendence. So this is why that inversion away from oneself via a misdirected aspirational process is a forsaking denial, dissolution, or impotent self-consumption. And it is those things if it lacks dialectical countervalence. Namely, the dialectic facilitates this, again, this opponent processing balance between different qualities. Yeah, so I said that without dialectic as a counterbalance to the aspiration to be oneself in transcendence, this movement can deny the voidhood of being, can deny the no-thingness of being. and get sucked into the abyss. This makes it a moving away from the void, and hence an inversion of the goal of aspiration. So the idea here is that yeah, by focusing too much on this aspirational development in one direction is a wanting to avoid what one doesn't want to admit about oneself. Um, so if one is escaping, yeah, the limited qualities, the mortal qualities, the finite qualities, this is kind of also escaping the void in a way. This is also denying the no-thingness of oneself, the meaninglessness of one's actual life, we could say. Um, I guess the thing is that, yeah, when we move away from voidhood, when we deny the aspect of ourselves which is not being, we actually then get sucked into the abyss because we move too strongly into this self-consuming spiral. And that means that the sort of antidote to that, if you like, is to establish this dialectical counterbalance where there's this, again, opponent processing internally and interpersonally as well between these different qualities. And that can actually facilitate our access to the no-thingness of being. So we can get more familiar, more intimate with the quality of oneself, which is no-thingness. And in that way, avoid getting sucked into nihilism, which is the same no-thingness, but with a very different face, with a very different aspect, seen in a very different way, with a very different emotive or affective valence. And so there's an idea that we cannot avoid, we actually cannot avoid the no-thingness of being. And so it's best to approach it in a relational, open, intentional way. So this is in yeah, again, this is in that sentence, the bottom of it's at the bottom of page 60, which reads, this inversion away from oneself is a forsaking denial, disillusion, or impotent self-consumption if it lacks dialectical counterbalance. The tension that resolves the self authentically and teleologically in its establishing power. So what do we mean by the tension? So in this dialectic, this opponent processing balance, there's a tension, a tonos. Um, Yeah, so the idea here is that this dialectic countervalence, so it's like being able to see the same thing from different valencies, seeing the same thing with different faces, seeing it in a different light, seeing it in a different way, seeing it from different perspectives. This is what we mean by dialectic countervalence. We also mean that within the dialectic, within the dialectical practice, there's this opponent processing of the self. Um, let's say intrapersonally still for the minute, there's this opponent processing of the self where we can see the same no-thingness from with different valencies. We can see it in its negative valence or in its positive valence. We can see it in different lights. We can see the same quality of no-thingness in different lights. And the idea that is that there's an implicit tension in this, continually seeing it in different ways. So the idea is that this dialectical countervalence. So the idea that the different ways of seeing something, different countervalencies can show up in dialectic. That that is actually necessary to sort of keep things unresolved. I keep them within tension. Whereas if we sort of only go toward transcendence or only go toward finitude, either interpersonally or intrapersonally, then if we only go in one direction, then that sort of makes one vulnerable to self-denial, to existential despair, to the sickness unto death, and to nihilism, because one sort of can only end up seeing it in that one way. Whereas if we are able to engage this opponent processing within the self and with others as well, there's a continual flexibility, there's an opening, there's a way of seeing things in different lights, and that keeps them from being closed into one aspect. And so it's a kind of creative tension. It's not a tension which is a final lack of resolution. It's a tension which is creative and generative. And so, yes, the idea is that even in the presence of aspirational development, if it's not aimed properly, if we're not aspiring in the right direction, um, then then it won't ameliorate nihilism. So aspiration on its own is not enough because aspiration can sort of veer off course. So if you imagine aspiration as a kind of rocket ship leaving the launch pad, well, if it's getting pulled too much to one side, then it's going to crash. Whereas this again, like if you imagine this rocket ship is being pulled in multiple directions at the same time, maybe then it can go straight. Um, yeah, even the presence of aspirational development, if it is not aimed properly by the counterweight of an opponent process mediated dialectical tension, will not ameliorate nihilism. So that's what we mean by tension in that context. It's the tension which is tonos, and it resolves the self authentically. Yeah, so this is the idea that it's within that dialectic, within that opponent processing between the different aspects of oneself, intrapersonally and interpersonally, um, that actually resolves the self. We actually get a more authentic resolution, again, in all those senses of resolution of who we actually are. And the idea is that any attempt to be oneself in any more limited and definable specific direction at the expense of going in other directions as well is vulnerable to nihilism. So to identify too strongly with any particular qualities rather than the capacity to combine and blend and change perspectives and see things from different valencies. So this is why that tension resolves the self authentically. And in terms of teleology, I've said so the tension resolves the self authentically in and teleologically in its establishing power. And so here, there's a connection between the regrounding anti-nihilism of dialectic countervalence, um, where the presence of the counterweight is connected with self-resolution, meta-narrative viability, power in the world, knowing how, personhood, and telos. What do I mean by that? So there's a way that I think the key idea here is the idea of a dialectical counterweight. So it's again this quality of like keeping things in tension by an ongoing dialectic, which yields a sort of lack of resolution in any one direction, where this going too strongly in any one direction via a misdirected aspirational process could lead to nihilism. So we want to kind of keep things in tension by continually subjecting them to dialectic. And so there's this quality of this being able to see things with different valencies is itself a kind of counterweight. What is it a counterweight to? It's a counterweight to seeing things only in one way, which is vulnerable to nihilism. And this dialectical this quality of dialectic that we can see things from different valencies, if you like, um, that's that's connects with our sense of self-resolution. It allows us to see the self more clearly. Um, but it's also connected, as we said, with teleology, because we've talked earlier about um, we talked about um, returning to tell the tale. We talked about telos in connection with Nishitani, the preceding paragraph. And we talked about knowing how. And so there's a connection here with this counterweight quality, this keeping things in dialectic, is connected with not only our ongoing self-resolution, but with the viability of our meta-narrative. So the story that we're telling about who we are. So this, again, this intrapersonal dialectic, say, between one's ego and the soul, this allows one to construct a new story about who one is. And that can lead to a more viable, a more livable meta-narrative of who we are, namely, and then what our personhood is. And so that allows us to connect all the qualities that come, as I said earlier with the framing in the previous video, that come with narrative order. So I'm saying this is about meta-narrative, and they do talk about meta-narrative in and narrative order in Zombies in Western Culture. So I'm essentially not going to go into that. I will a little. So I'm looking at page 24 of Zombies in Western Culture, and it's where there's a sort of a God's eye perspective beyond any particular character, which is sort of like the transcendent within. And there's a sort of RPG role-playing character, which is like the ego. And the meta narrative is the relationship between these two different perspectives that we can take up in one's life. In this video, to use an example, the viewer is in the position of the God's eye point of view, that perspective. And um, I, Sam, am the little ego who's sort of down here on the ground and moving through this. And the story that I tell about the relationship between those is the meta narrative in this context. It's a relationship between these different perspectives on identity. So that's kind of what we mean by meta narrative. I'm not going to go into the connection between meta narrative and narrative order, just to say that they're obviously connected. Narrative is clearly connected with a sense of purpose, a sense of knowing who we are, um, which, as we talked about, um, is connected with power in the world, knowing how to proceed. Um, Um, it's also connected with personhood. So it's not only that our self is resolved, but it's our sense of not only the self in a broader sense of awareness and awakening to the self. It's also a sense of the person that we are, who we are uniquely, individually, if you like. That our personhood is different from our selfhood. And I'm saying that this meta narrative also allows us to clarify the nature of our personhood. Um, It, yes, and it's also connected with telos, as we said. It's because it's resolving the self authentically and teleologically. So it's the story of who we are and how to move forwards, what we're moving towards in terms of religious life. And so all of this is the dialectic is facilitating this. So this dialectical engagement, for example, in Kierkegaard, it's within oneself, so intrapersonally. This dialogue that we have, this dialectic between the higher self and the finite self, if you like, allows us to create a new meta narrative between them. But it also means that we can see ourselves in different aspects, in different lights, and this this function of the dialectic is a kind of counterweight that allows us to resolve ourself, allows us to construct a more viable meta narrative. It allows us to operate in the world with more skill. It allows us to know how to operate in the world. It clarifies our personhood as well as resolving our selfhood. And it clarifies a sense of telos, the story of who we are and how to move forwards. Telos specifically in our religious life, how to move forward religiously, a sense of where to go, how to go forwards. Again, the sentence, this is the bottom sentence on page 60. Yes, this inversion, the inversion of aspiration into self-denial and into nihilism is a forsaking denial, disillusion, or impotent self-consumption if it lacks dialectic countervalence, which is the tension that resolves the self authentically and teleologically in its establishing power. And um, there are actually two senses of power that are there that are implied in the meaning of the sentence. So the idea here is that the dialectic brings a certain quality which is connected with this counterbalancing that I've been talking about. And the idea is that it holds open a certain tension that can resolve the self, resolve personhood, provide a new meta-narrative story, and orient us to a new teleology in our religious life. Um, but it can do so in its establishing power. So what that means is that the dialectic has all of this function because it sort of regrounds the self in a new power, if you like it. So there is a sense of um, grounding or a power that is sort of coming through us, and the dialectic uh, establishes us within that, and that is what holds open this tension that can resolve the self and do all these other things that I just named. So this is one sense of tension. Um, so what I think the authors mean by that is this establishing power is the power which establishes the self, which is sort of akin to Tillich's ground of being. Um, yeah, so there's the idea that the dialectic, by disclosing or making available this this sense of selfhood, um, can also disclose or make available the sense of the power which grounds our sense of self and our teleology. But the alternative meaning would be that would be an establishing of power, which I think is also true. So what I was saying there is that if we're able to if we're able to use the dialectic in this way to function as a countervalence, to hold open this tension, to resolve the self more authentically, to resolve personhood more authentically, to create a meta narrative between our finite and transcendent selves, and to orient to a new teleology to our religious life toward a new metanoia or spiritual conversion. If it can do all those things, then this is also the establishing of power in the world. This is also knowing how to move through that world. It's establishing a new purpose. It's establishing a new narrative order. It's not just grounding us in uh, it's not just grounding us in the power that grounds the self in the sense of Tillich's ground of being. It's also um, it also resolves the self authentically and teleologically. The way that it resolves that self is by establishing power for that self, if that makes sense. So there's a way that by knowing what to do, by knowing what one's purpose is, one is resolved, which is a different sense of power. Because, I mean, I guess what I'm talking about there is that nihilism is that we have no clue what to do. We don't know who we are, we don't know where to go, and this makes us weak. This makes us foggy. This makes us unresolved and subject to nihilism because everything seems meaningless. There's no clarity, no path is laid out for who we are. And it's not only a a new sense of what grounds the self that can and the power that grounds the self and the divine power, if you like, that can ameliorate nihilism. It's also the conversion of that into a story of who we are, the purpose of who we are, and what to do, where to go. It gives us a heading, it gives us an orientation, it gives us a certain skill, facility in the world. And so it makes certain powers available to us that is just as useful and important in ameliorating nihilism as regrounding us in the ground of being. Which brings us to the start of page 61. Hooray! So just on that sentence, again, it goes, the inversion is a forsaking denial, dissolution, or impotent self-consumption if it lacks dialectic countervalence, the tension that resolves the self authentically and teleologically in its establishing power. And I've said like power meaning power in this world, power to assert oneself within this world, not to leave the fate of the world to the bureaucrats. So it's power to self-actualize, not just to self-transcend. It's by becoming powerful, meaning grounded in the infinite finite reality just as much as in the ground of being the transcendent infinite reality. Um, so this is a heroic leap of infinite proportions into the finite fullness of a waiting and calling, beckoning life in this world. Um, and so we're talking about here about self-actualization, not just self-transcendence. It's this, I mean, this to me is directly connecting back to the sort of stuff about the meta crisis. It's not just this wanting to establish ourselves as an existential salve um, within our grounding sense of selfhood. It's also the converting of that into a story about who we are, a story so that we can come back into the world and live in that world and exercise power in that world. Power to not leave the fate of the world to bureaucrats. Power at the 11th hour, power to act in the world, meaning power to be grounded in the imminent finite reality that we are, um, which is what I'm defending against there is I'm saying if we can't do that, if we don't have that meta-narrative binding to the world, if we don't have knowing how, if we don't have a renewed sense of purpose, then we are subject to exactly what Kierkegaard was saying, which is this too much of a focus towards infinitude, too much of a focus towards existentialism, too much of a focus towards philosophy and being grounded in a power that gives rise to the self that we can't see. And so this if it's a sense that we have, it's a sense that we get. If it's an establishing power that it gives rise to, I think that has to, for it to be meaningful, I think, in Kierkegaard's own terms, I think it has to have this ongoing dialectical engagement with the world, actualization, bringing oneself into the world and sort of seeing how it goes. And maybe it doesn't go well, and then one has a chance to come back and sort of warm one's hands again at the fire of internal dialectic, and then see how it goes. But yeah, for me, even Kierkegaard couldn't do that because he's sort of like, if you just sort of stay stuck in your head your whole life and don't go out and actually talk to some people, then you don't have any power in this world. Um, and yes, he was able to contribute a lot of philosophy, but the whole point is that we're wanting to bring philosophy out of philosophy and back into the world so that it's useful, because philosophers, just like everyone else, are subject to the existential condition of life in this world. Surprising as that may be, a bit of a come down, but okay, so that takes us to page 61, and I'm going to keep going. So it's the final sentence of that paragraph. So again, Kierkegaard is talking about the mistake. So we're still talking about the mistake, the misdirected path that one can make. So we were articulating a whole lot there about what is the correct way to hold open this dialectic countervalence and all the benefits that that brings to hold open this tension dialectically in terms of opponent processing of the self. But the mistake that Kierkegaard was pointing to, and that I was sensitive to as well, is this co-opting of aspirational development in only one direction, which is like going too far in one direction and not holding open a balance with other directions. So going too much towards infinity and not enough towards the finite, or vice versa, or going too much towards any of the opposites that we can name, I would say. And so then Kierkegaard is then going to elaborate on what that's like. What is it like um, to fall into the abyss of nihilism by going too strongly in one direction with the co-optation of aspirational development and not enough dialectical countervalence? What is it like? Well, Kierkegaard is going to tell us. So they say, the top of page 61, one such aspect of this affliction. So there are multiple. So it's complex. Like it's a lot. It's meaning it's emotionally charged state to be in nihilism, and so it has many different aspects. That condition. One of those aspects is what they're talking about. Which invokes both Porphyry's caution and Nietzsche's abysmal confrontation, is described by what Kierkegaard termed possibilities to despair. So what we've said here is that we want to get a better sense of what we're hoping to avoid, what we're hoping to not fall prey to, what we're hoping to not succumb to, and we're going to use dialectic so as to do that. But we want to be clear about what we're moving away from, the risk that we're avoiding. And so we're going to use Kierkegaard as a way to describe that risk, or that affliction, as it's called. And that affliction has many different aspects. There are many qualities to it, and we're exploring just one of those qualities. And it evokes a bit of Porphyry and it evokes a bit of Nietzsche, and it's described by Kierkegaard with this term possibilities to spare, which he then goes into in this quote. So I've just said in passing that I'm just wondering if dialectic is really the only thing that can resolve that affliction. And so I guess I'm saying here as well that it may be worth imagining other tools beyond the dialectical that can resolve that affliction. And namely, I would mention in passing, John and co have developed a sort of structure of like what kinds of practices to include in an ecology of practices. And they're using sort of DIME, which is sort of like dialogical practices, imaginal practices, mindfulness practices, and embodiment practices. And so what I'm imagining here is that dialectic into Dialogos is an example of a dialogical practice which could contribute to the resolving of the affliction described by Kierkegaard. But other dialogical practices and other practices such as mindfulness practices, embodiment practices, and imaginal practices all could also contribute to the amelioration of this affliction of nihilism, and it's important to remember that and not get over-focused on one practice, namely dialectic into Dialogos. It's also important to mention that the ecology the community of practitioners within which one is embedded, namely one's community, and the place that one inhabits, and the law of the land of that place, how they survive in that place, the worldview that one inhabits, um, the sociological form of the way that one lives. All of this is also contributive to the amelioration of nihilism. And this is important because we don't want to put too much on dialectic. So the claims here is that dialectic resolves this. And I'm saying instead, maybe this dialectic contributes to this amelioration of nihilism. But we want to be able to be more broad and say, let's use as many tools as we have available and not put too much pressure on this one practice, because we may discover that, and I think we are discovering that, too much of a focus on only one practice actually can't uh, resolve this condition that Kierkegaard is so eager to describe. So, yeah, don't get too hung up on just one practice, and let's be imaginative about what else could help us resolve the affliction of nihilism. Um, I've also said in passing that part of the risk with Nietzsche was that it was his confrontation, qua confrontation, that was his mistake. So I articulated that in the first video of this series, that the attitude of confrontation is a sort of um, speaks to me of a unintegrated masculine shadow, the sort of confrontational engagement that was itself a mistake. So where one is facing up to the abyss, it's not available to surrender to and to become the void. And the confrontation with it is a sort of result of that. So it's an inability to let go. It's an inability to, like, one has to be in control. One has to be confronting and facing the threat. And yeah, to me, this is a unintegrated masculine shadow that Nietzsche, we can't, yeah, he couldn't do that. And I'm just going to leave that be as it is. And so, yeah, I'm saying that, yes, it may well be that possibilities despair is another form of this confrontation. But what I'm trying to get at here is that, again, is that the confrontation itself is a mistaken way of approaching the situation. It's the wrong attitude to bring to bear that speaks to a lack of skill. There's an underlying lack of ability to let go, lack of surrender that brings up that risk that Nietzsche then fell into. Yeah, and so I'm saying to frame the meaning crisis, to frame nihilism, sorry, to frame the meaning crisis as a confrontation with nihilism is actually to make Nietzsche's mistake. I think it's to bring to bear the wrong attitude. That's why I'm focusing on that in passing with Nietzsche. So then we get to this quote on possibilities despair. This again describing one aspect of the affliction of nihilism, as described by Kierkegaard on page 61. So I'm going to read the whole quote and then unpack it. So the quote goes, "Now, if possibility outstrips necessity, the self runs away from itself in possibility, so that it has no necessity to return to. This, then, is possibility's despair. Becoming oneself is a movement one makes just where one is. Becoming is a movement from some place, but becoming oneself is a movement at that place. In the end, it seems as though everything were possible, but that is the very moment that the self is swallowed up by the abyss." So let's talk about this. So there's a new distinction that is being made, a new pair of opposites that are being invoked, namely possibility and necessity. I'm writing them down. Possibility and necessity. And so, yeah, so for me, possibility is here clearly connected with transcendence, with infinity, and necessity is connected with the finite, and the immanent. And so, um, necessity is connected with, like, but what do we actually need? Um, whereas possibility is obviously connected with potential. So there's a potential and actual difference, which is sort of implicit as well. And so the idea here is that, again, it's this Kierkegaardian sort of, if we go too strongly in one direction, too much towards possibility in this case. And for example, that could look like too much towards transcendence, too much towards the infinite and not enough towards the finite. Um, when we do that, the self runs away from itself. Again, what we mean by that is that we go too much towards certain of our qualities and we ignore other of our qualities, which are real. So if we go too much towards the transcendent, we ignore those aspects of ourself which are finite. And this is what we mean by run away from oneself. And yes, we run away from oneself in possibility because by focusing on what one can be, we run away from what one actually is. So there's a by going into only possibility, we use possibility as a form of escape from who one actually is. I guess I'm saying about Kierkegaard, this is actually a confession, in the sense that, yeah, I feel like if someone, yeah, I mean, I won't go into Kierkegaard. I'll just say, um, yeah. So I'm making another set of connections. So we've already named necessity and possibility, and I'm going to connect them with a few other qualities which one might like to write down. So there's a connection between being and becoming. So where becoming is sort of connected with aspiration, and being is connected with non-aspiration. And so becoming is connected with possibility. So I'm writing them in the same column. And necessity is more connected with being. Um, I'm going to put transcendence and immanence, where immanence is going along with necessity and being, and transcendence is going along with possibility and becoming. We also have, yeah, um, limitation, and I'm going to put infinite. We could put, yeah, limited or finite, and unlimited or infinite aspects or qualities of oneself. And so this is also connected with sort of down and in versus up and out in the same two sets. Yeah, and I'm going to say here as well, I'm going to connect the intrapersonal with possibility becoming transcendence, infinite, and up and out within oneself. And the interpersonal, I'm going to connect with necessity, being, immanence, limited, finite, and down and in. So the risk is sort of, again, connecting these um, is sort of yeah, the risk is sort of to get tangled up in oneself, to get sort of too neurotic and introverted, and to go into only cultivating one's relationship with the transcendent and with becoming and with possibility. And we can see how this can sort of really lead to nihilism and sort of yeah, be radically disconnected from the reality of the actuality of our being rather than our becoming, the actuality of our imminent selves here on this earth, in these lives, in these bodies, with these other people who we might be ignoring or denying, um, with the interpersonal forms of dialectic that are necessary, um, not just possible. Yeah, and so we can see here how the and like each of these can be, you know, I don't want to make the sort of spiritual and material distinction. Um, So we can say that necessity and possibility, like it's important to hold all of these qualities in tension, as we said, in this, we're holding them in a creative tension, opponent processing between them. And that is a new form of spirituality, if you like. All of that is a new spiritual orientation. So I'm not identifying spirituality with one half or the other. Uh, I hope that is clear. What I can do is also put the abstract and I'm going to put sensory. taking from Jung a little bit, but that's okay. And so abstract is going along with the intrapersonal, with the infinite, with the transcendent becoming up and out and possibility, and sensory is going along with down and in interpersonal, limited, finite, immanence, being, and necessity. I hope that's clear. And then I can also just put, for the sake of symbolism, heaven and earth. And I hope it's clear where those two would go. Sensory with earth and abstract with heaven. So this is a guiding orienting set of uh, distinctions that we're talking about in this section. Yeah. And so we're going to connect that with so we're still in this quote by Kierkegaard, where if possibility outstrips necessity, so here we can refer to our set of distinctions that we just made. So again, as per the mistake that Kierkegaard is pointing us to, this is sort of veering too much in one direction. It's too much toward the side of possibility, not enough toward the side of necessity. If we do that, the self runs away from itself in possibility, so that it has no necessity to return to. And I think we can see that what I'm saying is that that's exactly the mistake that Kierkegaard made, which is exactly why he's such an authority to write about this condition. It's all a confession from Kierkegaard, where he had this girl, right? Looking at his wiki, and yes, I need to study Kierkegaard more, but so I think it's pretty clear to see the neurosis and also the profound contributions that we can now take up from Kierkegaard, but we can see that lack of wanting to emulate him. What happened exactly with him? Let me find out. Um, yeah, so he met a lady, Regine Olsen, who was 9 years younger, and they were engaged, but he broke it off after a year. Um, not entirely clear motives, but he revealed a deep conviction that he'd never be able to make her happy and chose to become a writer in solitude. But Regine continued to play a major role, almost mythological role, in his world of experience and diary entries for the rest of his life. Kierkegaard was emotionally faithful to her until his death, um, and she became the sole heir to all of his effects, I think. It's from Wikipedia. And so we can see how, I mean, obviously I haven't met Kierkegaard, so I don't want to be too hard on the poor guy, but I can think we can see that we don't necessarily want to emulate this way of life and that there's a real risk of evidence of neurosis here. And so what I'm saying is that she would be the real her is the necessity that he would return to, which is not available because he broke off the engagement and fell into the despair, fell into the whirlpool of possibility of intrapersonal becoming himself and not being grounded in the real world of a real relationship with a real woman. This is like Peter Pan. This is dead obvious to me. This is like so that is very, very clear why he would be able to write with such perspicacity about this particular condition. It's because he's in it. Um, and I'm saying that's not just like when we say it's an existential condition, it has to do with the choices that one makes about how one lives. Obviously, obviously. Anyway, the self runs away from itself in possibility so that it has no necessity to return to. So to me, this is the kind of if we get stuck in that category of possibility becoming transcendence, finite, up and out, intrapersonal, and abstract, and heaven. To me, this is an abdication of responsibility. So it's the it's the luxury. I'm making a caricature for the sake of drawing this out, right? So I'm going to pick on 19th and 20th century existential philosophers, people like Kierkegaard, people like Nietzsche, people like Jean-Paul Sartre, and Beauvoir, and the whole crowd of those crafty characters who are up to no good and leading people down the garden path. It's the luxury of a life which is subsidized by reliance on the interconnected complexity of our six-continent interconnected global supply chain, which necessarily supporting their being, their actuality, that is supporting their lives. They're writing about all their existential stuff is completely dependent upon the universities and all the rest of it that are not regarded in their focus on transcendence and infinity and becoming and up and out and the whole existential malaise of it. Um, so yeah, this choice to sort of yeah smoke cigarettes and write in French cafes for one's entire career. Um, this is not a contrib. This is not. I don't know. I mean, I'm coming down pretty strong on them, but it's not. I mean, they got us into this mess for God's sake. I don't see that they were trying to get us out of it. Um, I can avoid picking on them and at least saying that nihilism is showing up in their way of life. Um, yeah, I mean, I guess I'm definitely following along from Peterson here, but like, yeah, I think he's right about that. It's like this ingratitude toward the actual structures that support our philosophizing. It's our disconnection from the actuality of our lives. Um, it's an inability to be down and in, down and among people, to focus on the interpersonal, to be humble, down low to the earth. Um, it's an inability to focus on the necessities of serving as philosophers, serving the world, serving other people. This to me is symptomatic of nihilism just as much as it is trying to ameliorate it. That's why I'm being so tough on those silly, silly philosophers. Smart as they are, clever as they get sucked into the wrong category. And no wonder they fall into the abyss that they can't make any friends. Sorry, but anyway, okay, so this quote from Kierkegaard. We were doing the first sentence. Now, if possibility outstrips necessity, the self runs away from itself in possibility so that it has no necessity to return to. Again, it's an abdication of responsibility. It's a, it's a, it's a, it is an avoiding. It's a staying in the Peter Pan state and avoiding reality. It's a kind of neurosis because it's one escapes into possibility so that one doesn't have to return because one doesn't want to return because it's difficult to engage with actual reality because one has to admit that one isn't who one is in one's infinity, in the infinite nature of one's being. One has to come back down to the ground to reality, and that's hard. So Kierkegaard goes on. This then is possibility's despair. Yeah, the despair of possibility is actuality, is necessity. So becoming oneself is a movement one makes, just where one is. So what does he mean by that? So he's sort of describing the connection between the necessary connection, the inescapable connection between possibility and necessity, where if we're becoming oneself, let's say aspirational development, if we're becoming oneself, there is a place from which there is a from where a situation that one sets out from in becoming oneself. An example is like the hero's journey. Imagine that, okay, we go on a hero's journey to become oneself, like Simba in The Lion King. It's like, well, he sets out from the pride at Pride Rock, and then he returns to the pride at Pride Rock, and that's an inescapable condition of becoming oneself. That there's a from that someone comes from, a situation that one is coming out of, and then he elaborates. So there's a difference that he distinguishes between becoming and becoming oneself. So the sentence goes, becoming is a movement from some place, but becoming oneself is a movement at that place. Yeah, so if we're just talking about becoming, becoming is a movement away from the initial condition. So in a hero's journey, we go away from the community, right? We go away from the initial condition. But the idea is that becoming oneself is a it is as distinguished from mere becoming oneself is a becoming that occurs from out of that initial condition and then returns back to it in the hero's journey sense of returning back to the community. It's not just becoming by going away from necessity into possibility, away from the finite into the intimate, into the infinite. It's also a return back down, return back into the initial condition. And that's how we can get this cycling, this opponent processing between transcendence and immanence, between the finite and the transcendent, between being and becoming, between necessity and possibility. Yes, this is why the dialectic of yes, the dialectic holds open the tension between these conditions and allows us to opponent process between them and not get stuck in one direction or the other. And I want to say, like, again, Kierkegaard is sort of speaking existentially here, like we're becoming as if we're coming from some place, metaphorically speaking, but I can also say literally, when we're becoming, we're literally in a space in 3D reality. We're in our place in the world, the real 3D world, in time and space where we are, subject to the meta crisis and to other people and all the rest of it. And, probably wanting something to eat or like that. Um, it's literally from some place in reality, which goes along with the call for communities of practice, communities of practitioners. Um, yeah. And again, with the stuff about sociology as well, it's like literally some place where. So what I'm saying here is that if we're even just focusing on becoming oneself, where Kierkegaard says becoming oneself is a movement at that place. So what I'm saying is, if we don't have literally the place set up, because what I'm saying is there's two senses of place that are relevant here. One is a more existential sense of being grounded in a place and becoming oneself at that place, and returning to that place, that existential grounding. But I also literally mean a physical place in the world. And I'm saying, sociologically speaking, until we have that set up, even if we have this orientation to become oneself in the right way, we're not coming to it from the right place, literally from the right place in the world. And there are going to be um, risks that go along with that, which look like lack of community, lack of support, lack of community of practitioners, lack of ecology of practices, lack of a viable worldview, lack of all the other things that need to go along with a balanced way of life, coming out of a viable sociology that of which a necessary condition is a physical place in 3D reality from which one can become oneself. So it's only from out of that sociological condition, let's say, that one can become oneself in um, in a viable way. Yeah. And so the final line of that quote ends up being, in the end, it seems as though everything were possible, but that is the very moment that the self is swallowed up by the abyss. Yeah, so this is an elaboration on the same theme, which is just like, yeah, it might feel really good or look really good to go up into possibility, up into transcendence and becoming in the infinite. Um, but it's at that moment where we're deceived by that false direction, false thread, that the self is swallowed up by the abyss. Um, a little mythological example of that is like again Frodo in the Dead Marshes. Frodo following, you know, trying to go to Mount Doom to deposit the Ring of Power in Mount Doom and destroy the One Ring of Power. He's sort of spiritually vulnerable because of the power of the dark influence of the One Ring, and that means that in the Dead Marshes he succumbs to the glow of the lights and goes off in the wrong direction. And then he falls into the abyss, he falls into the lake, and Gollum rescues him. Um, so yeah, this is an example of that. Seeming as if everything were possible, but that's the moment that the self is swallowed up by the abyss. And so it's really impotence. It's impotence through and through. So I've written self-immolation via narcissism. So when one gets sucked into oneself and going up and into oneself, it's really, yeah, it's coping with the condition in the world, coping with the impotence of one's actual influence over anything real in the world. Self-immolation via narcissism. Okay. And so I am going to stop here after having talked about that quote by Kierkegaard, where we've talked about the condition that we're trying to avoid. Um, we've also talked about how to avoid it, namely how in the practice of dialectic. And the authors are now going to go into, in the next video, um, how do we articulate that place that we're talking about? How do we articulate the place that we need to come from in dialectic to hold open the tension between all these different qualities so as to avoid the possibilities, despair. Um, Yep. And we're going to go into that and that big next paragraph on page 61 in the next video. Bye.